Hi, I'm Hugh Whitmore. Welcome to today's Bible teaching entitled Proof That Christians Do Not Believe the Bible. Well, there's lots of proofs of that, but I'm going to go into two of the biggest ones today. But first, I'd like to say, be bold, be brave. I'm encouraging you to come to the conclusion I have that Paul is a false apostle, and he was put in the Bible falsely by the evil rulers of this world in order to destroy the truth of Jesus and his kingdom teachings. It's actually an exciting time in the history of the world because now many people are coming to this conclusion. And it can be painful at first because you'll realize that any church you go to, you'll have to withdraw from because they're falsely teaching Paul. But I suspect that churches without Paul will be springing up at some point in the future. Maybe you'll be the first one to start one. Well, let's get into our teaching, shall we? The first thing I'd like to start with is a suggestion as to why Christians don't believe the Bible. Two main reasons. One, most Christians don't read the Bible. I would say that less than 1% of Christians actually read the Bible, especially every day, as you should if you really want to stay in the Word and know God. I wouldn't have discovered that Paul is false if I hadn't been in the Bible every day and been in the Word. So most Christians don't read the Bible, so they don't really have a concept of the Bible. So what do? They take their cues on the Bible from religion. That's Catholic and Protestant both. And so religion tells false stories about God that do not match up with the book as you read it. And that's the second reason why Christians don't believe the Bible. Even the people who read it, call themselves Christians, read the words in the Bible, but they don't follow the story. There's a story in the Bible. The Bible isn't a book of stories. It is a novel. It's a story. It goes from beginning to end. It goes from the beginning of time to the prophesied end of time. We obviously haven't gotten there yet, but the Bible is put together, for better or for worse, as a book that leads you to certain conclusions. What's true in the beginning isn't true in the middle, and what's true in the middle isn't true at the end. That's just like any good novel. You read it and you figure out what the characters are doing. And of course, God is the main character. And the first thing that happens is that he loses his kingdom. That's the very first thing on the very first day of that creation was completed. He lost his kingdom to Satan. This is proven later where Satan tells Jesus when he tempts him that he can give him all the kingdoms of the world because they've been given to him. So it's well known, but Christians overlook that fact. They're afraid to put a limitation on God because religion tells him he's all-knowing, all-seeing, and all-powerful, which isn't true. He's not even in control of his own creation. So why am I bringing this up? Well, not to bash God and not to diminish him in your eyes, but to bring you to a point where you know what you're supposed to be doing for God, as opposed to what religion tells you is that all you're supposed to be doing is asking him for stuff and basking in the glory of what he gives you. And it's just not the truth. It doesn't match up with the story. So follow the story. And let's get to those two issues, the two main reasons Christians don't believe the Bible. The first one has to do with animal and human sacrifice. In the Old Testament, just after God lost his kingdom, Lucifer was in control of the world, and so he set up a system as to mirror God's system. God had set up a system of worship of the people he created, and they're supposed to worship him, which gives him energy. Worship energy flows back to him. God gives life. God gives power to creation through his energy, but the system was a loop system, and the energy was supposed to go back to him through worship. This worship is called different things in the Bible. Glory is the main one. So for example, when I worship God, I glorify him and give him glory. And you read through the glorification process of Jesus in the New Testament. God glorified Jesus which was giving him energy and power so that he could overcome death and then hopefully bring back the kingdom. Now, Jesus didn't fulfill that part of his mission. He did not have enough energy or glory from God to bring back the kingdom. And that's because Paul came along, and Paul is false, and Paul crushed that energy. And where does that energy go? It doesn't come from the believers of God to God. It goes from, it takes that and steals it and gives it to Satan. Well, in the beginning, Satan was using child and animal sacrifices as ways to get worship energy to him. And God had to counter that system by also requiring animal and human sacrifices. Why? Because God needed to pull people away from Satan in this barbaric age thousands of years ago, and hopefully over time civilize the people who worshiped him. And he did over time. But back then, they weren't civilized, and God needed to institute a system to steal back their worship from the devil. And so he did this by demanding the sacrifice of bulls, goats, and birds as a daily part of religious life in Israel. Oh, by the way, I'm reading from my book, The Moment Time Stopped. You can get that on Amazon, Kobo, iBooks, and Barnes & Noble Nook. Oh, by the way, also for you people who watch me, I'm also an author of children's books. If you're a Christian, or even if you're not, they're great, good, clean, fun, exciting literature. I have a book series called The Three Madelines, great for your kids. And even adults read my books. The ones who do say it reminds them of being a kid, which is something I really try to put in there. Anyway, so getting back to our study on human and animal sacrifice required by God in the beginning of time, the early part of human history, he required this to pull people away from Satan and get them to give him, God, our creator God, the worship energy of these things. And it was very common. And King David, who was a man after God's heart, said in Psalm 29:1, "Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty, give unto the Lord glory and strength." So that's what you're doing, giving God glory and strength by your ritual worship. Now, we don't perform ritual worship of animals or, of course, humans anymore. That was negated by the blood sacrifice of Jesus, who overcame death, so that now we worship life. But back then, it was death that was being worshipped to give energy to God and to take it back from Satan. So, for example, Lucifer is the energy behind all false religions, and he would appear, just as a little primer here, in forms that were suitable to his audiences. For example, he was called Baal, Ashtoreth, and Molech. But any form that he takes, Lucifer requires sacrifice, death sacrifice. He still does to this day. They're living in the past. It's a Babylonian regime that runs the world and has for 6,000 years, since the Garden of Eden fell. And if you follow it, you can see how that energy keeps them in power. And you see it all around you in the world today. But back then, when, for example, God was chastising the Jewish tribe of Judah, he spoke of those who had built the high places of Baal to burn their sons with fire for burnt offerings to Baal. That was Jeremiah 19:5. And even kings of Israel committed this horrible act. King Ahaz, who was only 20 when he rose to the throne, made metal images for the Baals and burned his sons as an offering. That's 2 Chronicles 28, 2-3. King Ahab, another king in the line of kings, there were the kings and then the judges, or the judges and the kings, in that order. He practiced something called foundation sacrifice, which is killing a child to keep evil spirits away from the new building. And the quote is, "He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn." That's in 1 Kings 16:34, if you want to look that up. The energy released through ritual murder is the highest source of power for the devil. And God, again, at that time, in the barbaric era, needed to copy that to draw Israel away from the worship of Satan, Baal, Ashtoreth, Molech. Anyway, God also, he fought two conflicting fronts in this war. First, he made laws forbidding the practice of child sacrifice to Lucifer. Now, this is what the apologists for God, who for some reason need to pretend he didn't require human sacrifice when he did. It's clear in the Bible, in the Old Testament. You see it everywhere, lots and lots of scripture supporting it. But they'll say that he banned it, so how could he allow it? Well, first of all, there are a lot of contradictions in the Bible, and you have to look past them in some cases. But in this case, God didn't say not to sacrifice to me. He said not to sacrifice to the devil. For example, he said, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech." That's in Leviticus 18:21. And he fixed the penalty at death. He said, shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering. That's Deuteronomy 18:10. He also made it worthy of the death penalty. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. That's Exodus 22:20. So to the Lord alone, you can sacrifice in the old days, but it must be to the Lord alone. Obviously, we don't do this now. But this was God reaching a barbaric people, Israel, whom he chose as his servant. And why did he choose them as their servant? And why did he call them his servant? Because a servant gives energy, power, and work energy towards their master. And that's what he was requiring of Israel. So he enforced it. And in the entirety of Numbers 25, 4-5, the Lord said to Moses, take all of the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. That's because these people were sacrificing, the Israelites were sacrificing to the devil. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. That's an image of the devil. At the same time, God required Israel to sacrifice children for him because he was in direct competition with Lucifer for the worship energy to maintain his kingdom, because he was going to lose it completely. And God's life has always been in danger. Now, there are people who deny that God can be killed, but that is just false. God himself said it's possible. God didn't come out and say, I can be killed by Lucifer, but at the Tower of Babel, which you can read the story, he said he was so freaked out. God was so freaked out by what was going on. They were trying to build the tower into the heaven to overcome him. That's what they said. And he said, if I don't scramble their languages, they'll be able to do anything they want to. Anything. The creator God of the universe said they'll be able to do anything. Well, these people who are apologists for this, for God, and say that he can't be killed and that he's all powerful, apparently don't believe the words that come out of God's mouth, because he said anything, and anything means his own death. And I actually think at this point in history, given the incredible amount of sin in the world and the few Christians who actually worship God, most Christians worship Paul, and they worship a false idol in Paul and a false Christ, and they worship a false method of salvation and grace, which is false. It's false. There's nothing called grace that creates salvation. Your works create salvation. That's what Jesus said. That's what the kingdom teachings are. That's what John the Baptist said. That's what James, the brother of Jesus, said. That's what Jude, the brother of Jesus, said. That's what it says in Revelation and what it says all throughout the Bible. And only Paul counters this with his false testimony, and it's why you need to turn away from him. So God was requiring this. The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn. That means give to me in sacrifice. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and beast, is mine. Here's the context for all of you apologists who say this doesn't mean human sacrifice. What's the context here? Is the context sin? Well, peripherally. Is the context salvation? No. Is it right living, which is a major context in the Bible? No. Is it a story of love or salvation? No, it's none of those things. It's a story here. In the story, they're talking about animal and human sacrifice. That's the context. I don't know how you could misread this. And the firstborns of your son you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. That's Exodus 22, and it's verses 29 to 30, excuse me. And later, God admits, again, if you go through the story, read it as a novel. What is God doing? What is our main character? What is he attempting to do? Here he later says of Israel, I defiled them through their very gifts in their offering up of all their firstborn, that I might devastate them. So he's wringing out of them this worship energy to devastate them and tear away and tear them down from their belief in Satan. In another law, God made sure that once a child or adult was set aside to be sacrificed to him, no one could change their mind about the offering. The quote is, no one devoted, who is to be devoted for destruction from mankind, shall be ransomed. You shall surely be put to death. That is Leviticus 27:29. And it continues in Leviticus 27:30. No one who may have been set aside among men shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. God is requiring, once somebody is set up to be sacrificed to him, that they must do it. Because God counts on this energy, he must overcome Satan because he's fearing for his own life, God's life. There are many other proofs, and the most telling is a story that's retold in the New Testament, is that there's a point where God calls Abraham as to start off essentially the race of people who are the Jews, to worship him, to set them aside. And he tests Abraham by telling him to kill his own son Isaac, Abraham's son Isaac, as a work of faith. That's in Genesis 22:2. And proving that human sacrifice is common at the time, Abraham doesn't complain to God. And in the Old Testament, Abraham spoke to God, Moses spoke to God, the great leaders spoke to God frequently. God was commonly interacting on a human level with people. And he didn't ask him why. He just went out to do it. He went out to kill his own son. And while he had the knife in the air, God saw that he was doing the work that he told him to create this sacrifice, and so he called it off. But it proves that human sacrifice was required by God and was very common. He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." That's what God told Abraham, and he just went and did it. Well, why did God do this? Well, we know that he did it to try to overcome the energy that Satan was getting from his sacrificial rituals. But he had to do it because, frankly, God was overcome by somebody more cunning and clever and, frankly, more powerful. Satan, Lucifer, I call him Lucifer because that's what they call him who worship him. Lucifer is more powerful than God because, and this is another thing people who apologize for God say, is that God can't be overcome, and there can't be somebody more powerful than God because God is the creator. But God didn't create sin. Lucifer did, because sin is an energy that thieves the energy from God, and that's why Satan is ahead of God, and there's a chance he could kill God. And that's why it's so important that you worship God and you believe the Bible and you follow the story and you find out what's really going on in there, because then it tells you God's life is in danger and I must worship him and give him glory and energy, and so that the heaven may be filled up with this energy. God can overcome Satan and bring back Jesus with a renewed kingdom. And that's what's going on in Revelation. If you read the book of Revelation, heaven is filling up with the saints, and the saints bring energy to God because they're the ones who have separated themselves from the false teachings of Paul. That's another thing going on in the book of Revelation. God rebukes Paul in his letters to the churches, and he says in Revelation 2:2 that I know that you have tested false apostles and found them to be false. Well, who is that? That's Paul. And that's the other thing that Christians, the second big proof today, is that Christians just don't want to believe that Paul's a false apostle. Revelation 2:2, Jesus is speaking. "I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance." He's speaking to one of the churches. "I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false." I'm glad I read that because my recollection is always paraphrasing. There are only 13 people who qualify as apostles in the Bible. The original 12 that Jesus called. And then, of course, Judas Iscariot, he killed himself after he was the traitor to Jesus. And then the apostles, the remaining 11, had some criteria. They picked one more apostle who was Matthias. And the criteria had to be that the person they picked had to be just like the original apostles. And they saw Jesus from the baptism of John until his ascension into heaven. And Paul had none of those qualifications. Paul could not have been an apostle. Nobody else is an apostle. The only other people who are called apostles in the Bible are Paul, who calls himself an apostle falsely, and people he calls apostles. Nobody else is called an apostle. Nobody calls themselves an apostle. Only Paul does that falsely. He's a liar, and just be brave and forget him and move on back and read the Gospels and read what Jesus is teaching to you. But this is another reason that Christians don't believe the Bible, because they read out of the words of Jesus' mouth that there are false apostles, but they don't want to believe Paul's false. They can find the criteria. You can go look it up, what the criteria for being an apostle is, and you can know that Paul's false right there. There are wicked people who run the world, and they create energy for the devil, their god, Lucifer, through confusion, injury, and death. When you look around you, it's all over us in the world. And it tells you that the church must be standing up. People must be turning from Paul, people must be abstaining from sin, and people must be following the kingdom teachings of Jesus, because energy to the devil by sacrifice keeps getting more and more every year in this world. I'm almost 59 years old. I've been aware as a thinking person for half a century, and sin has gotten worse every year that I've been alive. And it's because they need to keep increasing it to try to overcome God and kill him. For example, a contemporary example is these fires in California, and reaching back to the ritual that was created by the government, the rulers of this world at 9/11, and the destruction of that building and these fires in California, is they're using directed energy weapons created by the military that create this certain type of fire. You can see it. You can look it up on YouTube. You can see the work of Dr. Judy Wood, who discovered how the Twin Towers fell, not by a collapse and not by a fire, but by directed energy weapons. They're turning to dust on the way down. Never before has anything been seen like this. And the fires in California, they're doing the same thing, because they're creating worship, death energy, and destruction energy, and confusion, of course. Disasters create confusion in people. And they're doing that to give worship energy to the devil. Counter it through your own worship energy to the Creator God, the God of the Bible. You see this worship death energy all around you. It's everywhere. We have a poisoned food system. We have chemtrails raining poisonous aluminum down on us every day. We have poison in the vaccines, poison in the water, poison in the air by smog. We have abortion, 50 million abortions a year. You know, there were 50 million people killed in the 10 years of World War II, from the moment Hitler marched into Poland to VJ Day. 50 million people were killed globally. Now we've got that women, the right to fairer sex, killing 50 million babies a year out of their own bodies. It's an incredible, horrible world of sin and sacrifice. But the Bible shows us that only a small number of good, powerful Christians who deny sin, abstain from sin, and do works, righteous works unto God, and then give him the energy through ritual worship. That would be just regular worship, not by animal and not by human sacrifice, of course, but by the recognition of the power of the blood sacrifice of Jesus, and by the power of the Creator God, to ritually give your energy to God and to rebuke and deny the destructive forces of the devil and bring back the kingdom with Jesus.